Sup, Scott Blakely, Blakely Bassoon Studios, and Lil Ass Kicker's Bassoon Reads. You may recognize me from my last video tutorial of hot cross buns. Today, we're going to be looking at the Mozart Bassoon Concerto, specifically the exposition of the first movement. Even more specifically, we'll be using the Arthur Weisberg edition, which is specified for California All-State Band auditions. Now, this is the most popular bassoon concerto. And I know what you're thinking, Scott, my God, there's so many popular bassoon concerti. But if there are auditions in your future as a bassoonist, this piece will be on more of them than any other, which will present to you a challenge of not getting sick of it. While Mozart was certainly a genius of a composer, I think it's important to remember that at 18 years old, for those of you in high school, are really playing the music in a way of a peer. And those of us that are a few years out of high school are playing the music of a baby. Now, this baby starts the piece off with 2 repeated B flats. Not very exciting. How do you make your grand entrance with such a bland repetition of notes? This is something personally that I struggled with plenty of times when I would play this. If you try too hard, they sound heavy. If you don't put enough effort into it, they sound weak. So what's the feeling that we're going for here? I'll be honest, what actually inspired me the most for how to play this very first measure of the Mozart Concerto was one of my reed-making videos I made like 10 years ago. And I made like a little intro song. Let's all make bassoon reeds. By connecting it to 2 words. And honestly, I think those 2 words are great because for both of these words, the vowels sing out much more than the consonant. And the word let's, the vowel's in the middle, whereas with all, the vowel is at the beginning. So we have 2 different shaped notes. Let's all make bassoon reeds. And I really found this very helpful. If I actually think of putting a different word to it, let's say if I just said, bassoon tastes like meatballs. It actually feels like I'm halting the word bassoon rather than moving forward, and it has a different shape. I just find it really useful to think that I'm making a statement. You don't have to use the same words as me, but the statement has to go somewhere. We've made it through the first 2 measures. So let's talk about the third measure. One thing I should mention is I have been on the audition panel for California All-State Bands most of the last 10 years. And every time the Mozart Concerto comes up, one of the things that I notice a lot of is young players really slamming that low F in the third measure. There's not an accent written there, and I'm all for deciding notes should be accented. I don't think it's our ears that want that note to be accented. I think it's the bassoon likes to play low Fs nice and fat. So we need to make a little compromise with our instrument and say, hey, bassoon, not so hard on that F. And what we can do is we can let the low F start, not quiet, but soft, and then let it grow as we reach up to the E flat. One thing I want to mention is trills. In our modern era, it seems that most people believe that the appropriate way to trill music from Mozart's time is by starting on the upper note, at least in most contexts. When someone tells me that kind of thing, I still take it with a grain of salt. I'll bet that if you really got the people that are studying historical performance, there may be some disagreement or a lot more caveats than people realize to how trills are approached. And I would also argue that the music that's 251 years old, maybe we don't have to play it the same way it's always been played. Again, in the sort of audition setting, I think it's important to consider who you might be playing for. And I can tell you, once when I was listening to auditions, the other bassoonist that was with me complained that some of the other musicians were starting trills on the bottom notes, and he was docking them points for it. And I was kind of surprised, but like that was the kind of thing that really bugged him. So if you're really not punk and you're worried about pleasing the establishment, the safer bet is to start the trills on the upper note. I think that in this piece, I generally actually think that sounds better. Always the more important thing is to start the trills where you feel they should start. But generally speaking, I do think they sound better started on the upper note here, personally. But, whatever. Now moving on to measures 40 through 42. In particular, I like to try to think of stretching the first note of each trill, the first note of each slur. So the B flat and the F. Even if if you're sort of thinking that you're going to do like a hyper rubato version, which would be something sort of like this. A lot of times if we sort of in our mind might think that we're going to play it that way, but when we're actually playing in tempo, it doesn't exactly happen, but it still helps prevent us from playing too quickly. It's really important that if you're going to stretch the note, don't accent it. I think the stretch is sort of a different kind of accent. And so if you elongate a note and play it loud at the same time, I think it's overkill. It's heavy-handed. It's more like, see what I'm doing there? See what I'm doing? And that honestly also it starts to feel like you're not in control. Again, I've mentioned, I think the unintentional accent is such a common trait of student players. Like accents, if they are not intentional, seasoned ears will pick up on it. In the Weisberg edition, there is this diminuendo at the end of measure 41 going into 42. And I gotta say, I don't like it. I really don't like that diminuendo because I really think it's asking to swallow up the phrase. I get that the phrase might sort of peak around the high G grace note in measure 40. And so therefore you might want to pull back a little bit in measure 41. This is somewhat of a personal preference because I think some people, the idea is that they're blending it into the orchestra where the bassoon almost disappears in the accompaniment. I don't quite understand that approach because in this concerto, it really feels more like a conversation between the bassoon and the orchestra, or almost like the orchestra is kind of cheering on the big, robust bassoon. We can pull back a little bit in measure 41, absolutely. But I wouldn't want the downbeat of measure 42 to be even softer. Again, that's where the orchestra comes in, and it sounds weak. That's what it is. It's weak. I want that last B flat. It matters. I don't care what Arthur Weisberg has to say about it. Another danger in measure 41 is the B flat on B2. That B flat has a tendency to kind of be a bit louder than everything else. And that to me is sort of the strongest justification for why you might put a diminuendo there. Not really for the sake of actually getting softer, but for the sake of taking the edge off of that B flat. The next section here, measures 45, 46, 47, I think is a spot that there's really so many different ways to play it. And what I mean by that is the way that we group the notes. Also the articulation patterns. I've heard so many different articulation patterns people use. I'm sticking to the Weisberg edition's articulation pattern. But even with the articulation, it deserves your thought how you want to group these notes together. Is it sort of a conversation between slurred and tongue notes? Is it more of a pattern that goes up to the down, leading into the downbeats? Or actually, is it strictly groups of four? There's no right answer. This is a spot where you should change your mind how you want to play this. Maybe not from like audition to audition, but performance to performance. It's not the decision that I feel like is well made, spur of the moment, because I really think that it takes a bit of planning and sort of training your mind. The fact that there's so many different ways for this to work is one of the things that we can sort of use to prevent ourselves from getting so bored with it. Because this is played so quickly, I think that, the end result sometimes of how it is going to strike the listener's ear is pretty subtle, but I think the way that we think about it matters, and it does affect the way we play it. So I really recommend, spending some time playing around with it and deciding, how do I like to think of the notes grouped together? Certainly we play around with grouping sometimes just for the sake of getting it technically sort of challenging ourselves and we're teaching something. But I think the grouping matters more so musically in this instance. Right now, I'll tell you what I feel for those is actually one really long phrase that actually the group is just a really big group. Sort of like you keep expecting it to be done, but it's not done. Oh wait, no, I got more 16th notes, and now I have more 16th notes. That's just me though right now. I would never commit to that, playing it that way all the time. And it really is just so much about having put your own thought into this. It makes such a difference in the performance. Sometimes that difference feels very subtle, but it all adds up. If you did watch my tutorial on hot cross buns, I talk a lot about the importance of sort of being really mentally engaged with the music. And I think this is one of those instances that's really engaging, and there's just so much variety in how to approach it. Now, right after that is when we have this one little offbeat section, you know. I think that something that is really important to do there is to make sure that the offbeats are really clearly articulated. I actually think the clear articulation is more important than even having perfect timing there. What I mean is I've actually even seen old recordings of myself playing this, and you could tell like I'm just like, I gotta get right on that and. I've got to make sure the notes happen on the and I'm so concerned with like being on time. That honestly, you know, I don't think that that's what this is all about. I think those offbeats aren't about like creating a perfect juxtaposition of the downbeat, but rather creating a sort of carefreeness of like, oh, I'm not going to play on the beat for a few notes. I'm not saying forget about your tempo, although maybe you could. A lot of times offbeats serve a certain purpose of creating a sort of agitation or contrast or sort of against the grainness. To me, these offbeats don't do that. These offbeats are much more carefree, and they're just sort of about being like, hey, I'm floating above this strict sense of time. Oh, I'm not going to play on the beat. This may be a controversial approach, but you can't make compelling music without being a little controversial. I think making sure that it's clear where those notes are, where you're starting the notes, and that you're in charge of the notes is what really matters. I don't want it to be right? Okay. Speaking of having a sort of relaxed attitude towards rhythm, let's talk about measure 50 and how fastidious I advocate for being. 30-second notes are not the same thing as 16th notes. 30-second notes are twice as fast as 16th notes. What's written, at least in every edition that I have ever seen of this, and okay, that's maybe only a handful, are 30-second notes. The original manuscript of this has not survived. So maybe Mozart wrote it as not a dotted eighth, but just an eighth, and then two 16th notes. Okay, but I think it's 30-second notes. That's kind of tricky to do. It happens a lot faster. And so what I recommend doing is actually practice a little bit without the trill. And four, and a one, E, and a. It can be tricky to hit that after the trill, but this trill at least is relatively simple. You know, trills make rhythm more difficult. They just do, because it's kind of just frantic what we're doing. You know, we're doing something sort of frantic on a trill. So practice that a bit without the trill to feel the 30-second notes. Speaking of practicing without the trills, let's talk about practicing trills. I just want to talk briefly about the B flat to C trill. I find really, really works better if you vent the D key, if you have a D key, instead of a C key. It's much more in tune. With some of these fingerings, you need to check your instrument because they're built differently. The vocals are different, we build our reeds differently. So sometimes slightly different fingerings work better for different people. There are, like I said, so many trills in here. And in this next section, all the trills involve the third finger of the left hand. And for most, you know, more of us are right-handed than left-handed. So it's the weakest finger for many of us of the weakest hand. But even if not, like, it can be really awkward and fatiguing to do so much trilling with that finger. So I think it's worth it, if you're working on this concerto, to spend some time practicing these trills. Not in context, but out of context. So why do we practice the trill out of context? So we can focus on what exactly we're doing, what's happening. We want to keep our finger as close as possible. Any excess movement is going to make it so we can't go as fast. In doing that, it's really hard to do this without feeling tension. So what I'm trying to do when I practice the trill is I might do several of them really slow. And I'm not even going for a regular speed. I'm just kind of like, let me feel that out. What is the smallest amount of movement I can do that's not awkward for me? Because I think sometimes if we try to move too little, we build up tension. And I don't want to feel tense, but I want to move as little as possible. I need time to feel it and to play around with it. Can't do that if I'm playing all these other notes, right? And maybe I'm going too fast for an example. If you practice something like that for several days, or maybe a week or two, honestly, don't even think about speed. Just do that for, a couple times. So no more. I'm not talking about any more than 90 seconds of practice. But give it that sort of 90, okay, fine. Give it 60 to 120 seconds of practice every day for a week or two. And then check in with yourself. Say, do I feel like, say, okay, now maybe I want to try doing it really fast. I want to focus on speed. But as you focus on speed, we also need to focus on, again, not having tension here, because we have this trill so many times and so many other things are going to be tempting our fingers to get tense that actually, if we can let those trills be moments of relaxation, in a sense, that's a good thing. It can keep us more grounded there. It can be the CDD trill, but even the B flat to C trill, most of us use the same finger, right? Another thing that I will sometimes do, I will do a 3-finger trill. I will just sort of let my finger sit here, and I will take these 2 fingers and trill. It sounds cool. It's actually kind of relaxing. I'm not really sure if it's actually that beneficial, but it's fun. One other thing I wanted to say with trills is I generally don't like to think of my trills as any sort of particularly rhythmic thing. I like to think of it as a state of being. It's sort of like fidgeting, I'm sure you can sit at your desk, right? And just be kind of doing this with your pencil and feel like you're being perfectly still, but you're actually not, right? This is just sort of a state of being is what I mean. Then the note becomes one note. Normally we might play a C this way, but in this case, the C actually happens to be this. I'm not thinking of it as CD, 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 or any particular rhythm. Playing a trill could sort of be like if I was trying to get someone to count, 1, 2, 3, 4, but at the same time I'm going 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. It's not easy to do when you're doing all this frantic motion. But if the frantic motion is more just like, I don't even think about this. I'm not really putting much effort into this. This is just how my arms are. Then I can probably count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. Oh, I hope that makes some sense to you guys. Let's move on. So in this section, it's really common to add grace notes after every single one of those trills. I hear them in most recordings. In this edition, they're not there. I doubt it would be hurtful to play with the grace notes. But the one thing I would suggest is when those grace notes are there, they start to sound an awful lot like those 30-second notes. And so I guess to me, the question is, if you're playing those grace notes, are they really 30-second notes? If they're not 30-second notes, are they slower? Are they faster? Like, is there a way to make them distinct from the 30-second notes that are written just before measure 51? And I guess the more I've been sort of thinking about it this week as I prepare to make this video, it kind of makes me feel less like playing grace notes everywhere else, because I think it takes away from that specialness of those 30-second notes. And I think personally right now, if I were to try to do that, I would want to try to make them all 30-second notes. And frankly, that would just be really, really hard. And I don't think it would be appreciated enough for how difficult it is. Therefore, I don't feel like doing it. But again, this is the kind of thing, like a piece that you play so many times. This is not something that I feel like ardent about. It's just sort of, I want to give you a peek into my mind of what kind of things I think about here. My fingers are so used to doing those grace notes, though, that they sometimes just like, they just want to play the grace notes still. That's weird. Okay, this is another section where the slurred notes have a tendency to get rushed. And therefore, if we actually attempt to go in the opposite direction and sort of stretch them just a little bit, I think it can sound musical. I think it can provide, especially if you are not quite getting your 30-second notes up to being a true 30-second note, stretching that slur can make them sound more like they were 30-second notes. If you're too good at it and you actually manage to stretch every single one of those slurs, I think it sounds pretty tired and it doesn't really work. But I think for a lot of students, if you're intending to stretch the note, but you're playing really fast, the note doesn't actually get stretched. It just gets not rushed. So I would look out for it, like check in on what you're actually doing. I'm not advocating that every single slur should be stretched. What I am advocating for is maybe that first slur on measure 51 should be stretched, and maybe you feel like, you know, another slur or two in there actually should be stretched. My teacher, what he would often do sometimes for me is he would write an accent on certain notes and or a tenuto mark on certain notes, and then he'd put it in parentheses. And what he meant by that was, it's like saying, you're going to sort of attempt to do this, but the goal is not to actually do it. At the very end of this section, measure 58, there was a quarter note, and I think it's very important, especially in the context of an audition or whenever you're playing for other bassoonists that really know this piece, to play the quarter note its full value. Too often I hear this being played, and it's sort of like, oh, a chance to breathe. So they just kind of like let the music stop a little bit early. They'll play something like, you know, and it's like, what? You just gave up right before you got there. One other piece of advice I have, I just want to talk about the rest between measure 58 and 59. When people are playing this in an audition context without accompaniment, those rests can feel really beated. It's like you can feel the person playing 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. Duh. You know, not only can you sort of feel it as a listener, like it's really a drag as a player to be like, oh, you're playing this beautiful, exciting music, and now you're just like 2, 3, you know, you come in again, and now you're supposed to be a compelling musician again. So as much as I am a fan of counting, I think that there are times when hearing the music is better than counting. Here's a spot where the horns play. Feeling that music is so much better than counting. It's so much better. It feels better, it's less boring, and it prepares you to actually play more. And then when you do have accompaniment, you spend more of your time like actually having your mind, your ears engaged with the music. Counting is absolutely necessary so many times, so often it's necessary. I always opt for hearing music over counting. This is especially true for things like the Mozart Bassoon Concerto, which you're almost certainly going to be over practicing throughout your time as a bassoonist. Measure 64, the grace notes. Don't know if I quite call this a controversy, but there are a lot of strong feelings about these grace notes. You have probably heard recordings where they're played very short. Right? You very well may have also heard recordings where they are played essentially as eighth notes. Oh, I started the trill on the bottom note there. My best understanding of the argument for playing them as eighth notes is that these are actually appoggiaturas. In other words, they are dissonances above the chord. And if you play them too quickly, we miss out on that tension of a non-chord tone being played and then resolving to the chord tone. I certainly don't believe that there is, you know, a right or wrong way to do this. What's odd to me is that people never mix it. And if I was going to be playing this tomorrow, I right now I'm kind of in the mood for doing the first one short and the next two long. I think that might blow some minds if you play it that way, but you know, why not? I feel like this sort of like modern trend in how the way people are playing this, at least, or the American trend, is to play them as eighth notes. Most bassoonists are not historical scholars, and it's a rare thing for a musicologist to be certain and unopposed about something like this. So you're gonna have to make your own decision. Deal with it. Now we get to measure 66, and similarly to measure 50, the 30-second notes are back. And this time, they're incredibly difficult. In fact, I have spent a lot of time this week listening to recordings and slowing the recordings down of some very, very well-renowned bassoonists who I will not name, because virtually all of them botch this fourth beat. Or at least no, I'm going to say it. Virtually all of them botch this fourth beat. It's mush. Even when you slow it down, you can't quite tell what's going on. They're definitely not playing 30-second notes. In most cases, they end up playing the last two notes as sixteenths. Listening to all these recordings made me think, am I crazy? Nobody's playing this as written. Is it just become the sort of convention to let this one spot just sort of be so dizzying and kind of ambiguous that that's just like what it's there for? Because it does. The music gets kind of dizzying here is how I would describe it. But I think that it's very possible to actually play this as written. But it takes a lot of practice. And I'll be honest, I don't think I've practiced it enough, because I've really kind of only been working on this for like the past week or so to make the video, to pull it off. But I've definitely made progress. So let me talk about how I practice this. First of all, I think that it's important to separate practicing the 30-second notes from practicing the trill. A decision here needs to be made, because it is very difficult to get the trill to come out. The basic trill fingering for E flat to F is just to leave off the right hand. The right hand really stabilizes E flat, but when you're playing it so fast, it doesn't really have that time to exploit that instability. So it works pretty well. So if you start on the upper note, on the F, you know, the hope is, I think, to get two iterations of F, E flat, F, E flat. That's, I think, pretty possible. But, you know, for some people, this is a point where your fingers are probably going to be feeling a little fatigued, that you might say, I just can't fit that in there. I'm going to just play it as a triplet. I've heard plenty of people play it as a triplet and play it as a triplet. I think that's fine. Honestly, I think what's more important is to, again, sound like you're in control of your instrument. Depending on how much time you have to practice and sort of where you are, you can do it either way. Now, the 30-second notes. For some reason, I personally find I don't want to use my trill fingering going from D to E flat. I want to use the real E flat fingering. 4 E and out of 1. 4 and hey, that's totally possible. I can play that. 4 E and. Now, the thing that I think is important after practicing those 30-second notes is to follow it up with the next several 16th notes. I should say this. I think one of the reasons why so many recordings play this poorly is because they choose a tempo that works really well for everything else, but it's just a little too fast to play this. Is they just sort of make that decision, you know what? I can handle that being a little mushy. It goes so fast, ears aren't really going to pick up on it. Maybe, you know, because I don't know if I could quite get this up to like a Klaus Tunemann tempo. But, you know, listen. It feels if I can do it like that, where I start on the 30-second notes, it means that I can do it with enough practice. The next step that I would do is I'd sort of just do them in succession. And when I do this, what I can feel is, having just gone done the trill, is there's tension here, and it makes those 30-second notes feel a little bit sticky. Yeah, it definitely is sticky. I don't know if it's about fatiguing the fingers or sort of disorienting the fingers about playing that trill that makes playing those 30-second notes difficult. But you may have noticed this sometimes with music that's difficult. When you practice it, it becomes not difficult. So I think with enough practice, it's actually possible to play this really well. And you know, let's face it, most of us are going to play at a tempo that's maybe a few clicks slower than a lot of the recordings we've heard of this, and then it's even more possible. What I should also do is I should actually, you know, slow down my own recording right here, and we'll see. Stretching the first 16th note of measure 67 can help make the 30-second notes in 66 sound more like they were 30-second notes, even if they weren't 30-second notes. But yeah, this is just a spot that I feel like people just give up on that spot. They just give up there, and they let it turn into mush. If you're gonna go for it, if you're gonna go for actually nailing this beat, you're gonna need to practice again. Practice the trill separately from the 30-second notes. And whenever you're doing a run through or playing a longer section, what I would then recommend doing is, rather than attempting to play it as written and sort of falling flat on your face, is play it as a 16th note D. You know, and you can do that for weeks on end, because it'll act as a sort of placeholder for where the 30-second notes happen, but your fingers become less busy. I would love to go to a concert hall and hear a professional soloist play this and just not trill there. You know, don't play that trill, just play the 30-second notes. How bad would that be? What if we didn't trill? I don't know. I almost like that better than something that sounds kind of mushy. I challenge you guys to play this better than most people play it. I think it's so possible. So possible to play it. All right, so now I'm getting to the very end of the exposition, at least. I want to talk about the high G trill. A lot of people do not have a good fingering for this trill. But you know where you can find a good fingering for this trill?
The mother of all trill charts! Trill to the extreme!
And guess what? Because you're watching this video, I'm going to give you the trill fingering. What it is it's essentially like a normal G fingering. And then you need to trill both of your thumbs together. Your thumb is going to hit the B flat key. And then on my bassoon, I think on most bassoons, if you hit the C key and the A key, it works better than the alternative, which is the C sharp key and the A key. The problem with doing the C sharp and the A key, which a lot of people I think use, is that it makes the high A pretty flat. And with the one that I'm advocating for, with the C and the C and the A key, it makes the A little bit sharp. So what do? How can you make it not so sharp? Well, first of all, you could just accept that it's slightly sharp because it's going so fast. I think it's less offensive to the ear there to be slightly sharp than slightly flat on your high note. But one thing that I actually sort of just recently discovered, and we'll have to update the mother of all trill charts with, is that if instead of the resonance key, we use the D flat key, it brings that pitch down just a hair. That it really produces a really nice trill. And then, of course, the difficult part is then going back to landing on the F. You want to go back to the normal resonance key. And if you're playing grace notes before the F, like a lot of people do, it's going to need practice. Simply because your two thumbs have to move perfectly together. If they get out of sync, it sounds terrible. But when they're really moving together, they sound really good. And this is kind of awkward because we're really spreading that left hand out pretty far to get, especially if you're going to use the magical D flat key instead of the resonance key. And I have big hands, so I imagine it's particularly awkward if you have small hands, but don't let small hands stop you. Just like the other trills, I think it's really helpful to spend some time playing the trill completely on its own, not necessarily for speed, but for efficiency, and to try to eliminate whatever tension you can. Because eventually we want this motion to be quite automatic. And if it's less than perfect, it will not sound good. I can't tell you how many times I've heard, someone play so well and then they use a crappy trill fingering and it just sounds so pathetic when they get to the I mean, it sounds sad when they get to that last note. I don't know, maybe Mozart originally put it in there. I doubt it, but there's an ossia there in many editions, including what's believed to be the first edition. So take that, Mr. Smarty Pants. Which basically says, hey, you want to play it an octave lower? Because it's much easier to trill an octave lower, right? If you really aren't having luck with this trill fingering, if you don't have the patience to learn this trill fingering and to really practice the trill fingering, if you're short on time for whatever reason, and you're just like, I'm not going to get it, I think it's worth considering actually taking that lower octave to make a nice trill. The last thing you want is to end the exposition with an ugly ass trill. So this concludes our walkthrough of the exposition of the first movement. Please subscribe, hit the little bell icon so that you can be notified when I put out videos on the second and third movements in the coming months. I'll also add them to the description when they're ready. Happy practicing. You keep expecting it to be done, but it's not done. No, I'm gonna say it. Virtually all of them, bleh. I don't care what Arthur Weisberg has to say about it. I'm not gonna play on the beat. Don't let small hands stop you. My God, there's so many popular bassoon concerti.